Thank you for joining me in this series of videos on understanding Gurbani by yourself and for yourself. You would have noticed that the word yourself appears twice in the topic. So, what we intend to lay out is a methodology for understanding Gurbani. Now, methodology is a big word, but if you look closely, the starting word is method, the how of it. If you wanted to understand the meaning of a verse from someone else, a Granthi, a Pracharak, a Ragi, or a Baba, all you needed to do was to ask and listen. But if you wanted to understand it yourself, for yourself, you will have to do more. You would need a method. Let me give you a simple analogy. Let's say you needed to go to a certain place X. Now, if you relied on someone else to take you there, all you needed to do is to follow. Hop into the car and be driven to place X. But if you wanted to go there yourself, you would need a method. You will need to research the place on the map. You will need to look at Waze or Google Maps or even a paper map. Then you will have to follow the instructions yourself. That is the method. And if you followed the method, you would get there by yourself. In the field of knowledge, in the field of training and learning, we use the term methodology. But methodology is more than just method. Methodology has principles. We need to know what the principles are. We need to know how to apply them and when to apply them and when to make exceptions. So, methodology is a structured procedure for acquiring knowledge or verifying knowledge claims. For the purposes of these videos or this series of videos, we will look at methodology as a structured and systematic process for understanding Gurbani. The structured process can be called a framework. For easy reference, we will call our framework the Gurbani framework. We will look at 10 principles in our series of 8 videos. These 10 principles will allow you to understand Gurbani by yourself, for yourself. I have been working on the Gurbani framework methodology for some 12 years now. When I wrote my books on Gurbani recently, I used the framework. I have continued working on the framework in my quest to understand Gurbani better. This methodology has worked for me. I found that I was able to get an accurate understanding of the messages of Gurbani, an understanding that was logical, reasoned, and one that made sense. So, I want to share the methodology through these videos with anyone who wants to understand Gurbani for oneself. Now, these are the 3 things that you would learn in the videos or in this series of videos. You will learn the tools you need to understand Gurbani by yourself, for yourself. You will learn the 10 principles of the methodology called the Gurbani framework. And you will also learn how not to interpret Gurbani. Each video will begin by first explaining the principle that we are looking at. We will then illustrate and apply the principle using examples from within Gurbani. And we will do this across all the 10 principles. The first principle of understanding Gurbani is that we need to get from the literal to the spiritual. In Punjabi, akhri artha to bhav artha tak. Take a moment or two to let this settle in your psyche. If we remain on the literal side of things, we will not get any kind of understanding of the spiritual messages. Let me explain. You see, Pyareo, the objective of the messages of Gurbani is to bring about a realization of the divine within the human conscience. This is a basic objective. It is a foundational objective of the messages of Gurbani. It is a spiritual objective. But why have we labeled it as a problem statement? How does it become a problem? Well, it becomes a problem because the language of our daily usage does not have the required vocabulary for this foundational Gurmat objective. In other words, we have a spiritual objective, but we don't have a language for it. We don't have a vocabulary for it. Yet another way of stating this problem statement is that the spirituality of Gurbani does not have a language intrinsic and inherent to it. We have to use temporal language, the literal language, to get to the spiritual message. That's the challenge. In essence, then, we have a spiritual objective, but we don't have a spiritual language. What we have is a temporal language, a literal language, or a worldly language. That's the challenge. So, the principle is that Gurbani is written in temporal and literal language, and the messages are spiritual. We will need to get from the literal to the spiritual. And if we don't do that, we will miss the point of Gurbani versus or the Shabad or the Bani altogether. And we have been missing the point. That is why when we look at the translations or when we look at the screen in our Gurdwaras when the Shabad is being sung, it seems to make no sense. It appears to be making no sense. The problem is not Gurbani. The problem is not the Gurbani writers. The problem is we are not able to get from the literal to the spiritual. We don't know how. No one tells us how to. Everybody, including our Granthis, our Ragis, our Pracharaks, Kathakars, they are all content, they are all satisfied with the literal. Let me illustrate this principle with a non-Gurbani example. Hopefully then, all these things about literal, temporal, worldly and spiritual would become clear. I believe many of us are familiar with what is depicted on the image. The movie is Jab Pyar Kisi Se Hota Hai. The actors are Devanand and Asha Parekh. The year is 1961. These are the lyrics of the song. 100 साल पहले मुझे तुमसे प्यार था. And this is the translation. I was in love with you 100 years ago. So in 1961, Asha Parekh is 19 years old, and Devanand is telling a 19-year-old Asha in 1961, 100 साल पहले मुझे तुमसे प्यार था. Now, the literal meaning of that is that Devananda loved Asha 100 years ago, which means 1861. The problem with that is that neither Devananda nor Asha existed in 1861. You see, Pyareo, in 1861, Asha would have been negative 81 years old. So you see, the literal meaning makes no sense. Anyone who tries to say Devanand was in love with Asha in 1861 will be laughed off the planet. So we can agree that Dev being in love with Asha in 1861 is not the message. And if someone does come and say, but that is what is being said 100 saal pehle, 100 years ago, he or she would be laughed off. In other words, we agree that Devananda being in love with Asha 100 years ago is not the message. You will also agree that Devananda being in love with Asha in 1861 is also not the message. 100 saal pehle is not 100 years ago, even though it appears in the lyrics. Why? Because that is the literal translation. We agree it is not okay to translate and interpret the phrase 100 saal pehle as 100 years ago. So, why then is it okay to translate this Gurbani verse as follows? बहुत जन्म बिछड़े थे माधो, ए जन्म तुम्हारे लेखे. As for so many life forms, for so many incarnations, I have been separated from you, Lord. I dedicate this life to you. 100 saal pehle is not 100 years ago. But bahut janam is many past lives. You see, Pyareo, once we start with a wrong translation, a faulty translation, the messages that emanate or emerge out of such a wrong translation are all problematic. The Gurbani verse is bahut janam bichare the madho. The wrong translation is I have been separated for many past lives. The messages, the wrong messages that emanate are as follows. First, that Gurbani says we have past lives. Second, that Gurbani says we have afterlives. And third, that Gurbani says we reincarnate. So the question is, why is the literal translation of the Gurbani verse okay, but not okay when it comes to the song lyrics? Because the 100 saal thing, you figured it out yourself. And no one bombarded you with the translation that it was really about 1861. But the bahut janam thing, you have been bombarded with the literal translations by our granthis, ragis, parcharaks, tikas, translations and all sorts of social media apps. That is why for the 100 saal kind of a thing, we do not need any methodology, but for Gurbani, we do need. For 100 saal kind of things, you figure that out for yourself. Hopefully, at the completion of our series of videos, you will also be able to figure out Gurbani for yourself as well. One more point on the 100 saal thing. Before I go back to Gurbani, there is a reason why I picked these lyrics, and that's because the lyrics talk about love, and because love is a spiritual emotion. Now, because spirituality has no language of its own, because there is no spiritual vocabulary, the spiritual emotion that is love has to be stated in temporal or literal terms. There is no specific language for the spiritual emotion that is love. So it needs to be stated in temporal phrases such as 100 saal. We have thousands of words in hundreds of languages that translate the emotions of love. But the whole and complete story of the spiritual emotion that is love still remains untold. Thousands of people have written thousands of works on love, from Aristotle to Shakespeare to Nanak Singh the novelist to Sudhir Ludhianavi and Amrita Pritam the love poets. and many more. But the whole story of love remains untold. Why? Because love is a spiritual emotion and the language we have for it is temporal. This does not mean we will never get to know or understand or appreciate love or the emotions of love. We would have to make a leap from the temporal to the spiritual to do that. Why would we have to make the leap? Because as human beings, the emotion of love is part and parcel of our makeup. It is what makes us human. So we need to understand it to be able to be human. Similarly, there are also some Sikhs who say, Guru diyan gallan Guru hi jane. Only the Guru knows the real meanings of what he wrote. We Sikhs will never be able to get to those real messages of Gurbani. And my response is simple, but the Guru wrote the messages for us. They are intended for us. We need to understand them. We need to get to the spiritual from the literal. Recall our problem statement about Gurbani above. The spirituality of Gurbani does not have a language intrinsic and inherent to it. Similarly, love does not have a language intrinsic and inherent to it. We have to use temporal language. We have to use the language of the world. Recall our other problem statement. The language of our daily usage does not have the required vocabulary for core Gurmat concepts. The language of our daily usage does not have the required vocabulary for love as well. Now I hope you see why I brought in the 100 saal pehle thing. It was to allow you to appreciate through the use of a common example what our first principle is all about. So that is why we have this principle as the first principle of our methodology. As I said above, there are 10 principles altogether. Some will be crucial, some will be critical. This main principle is what I call basic. It is the most foundational. We need to get from the literal to the spiritual. Only then will we know that 100 saal is not 100 years. That is the literal translation. The spiritual message is something else. Only then we will know that Bahut Janam is not many past lives. That is also literal. The spiritual message is something else. Only then we will know that 84 lakh, 84 lakh is not 8.4 million. Literal again. The spiritual message needs to be discovered. These are metaphors and idioms. We need to understand them as such. By the way, when Dev says, 100 साल पहले मुझे तुमसे प्यार था, Asha's reply is, सदियों से तुझसे पहले जिया बेकरार था. I was impatiently waiting for you since centuries ago. Sadiyon pehle literally means centuries ago. Yet, it does not mean that. When your mother says, Tenu 36 baar keh chuki haan, I have reminded you 36 times. The reply is not, Maa, kal 2 baar kiya si, aaj 2 baar keh deta. So, 36 baar kithon keh deta? Now, you said it twice yesterday and twice today. What is this thing about 36 times? This is not the response. Only a silly kid will respond in such a way. Chatti var is an idiom. It cannot be taken literally. It cannot be translated or interpreted literally. This is what we intend to do. Get from the temporal language to the spiritual message. I called it a crossing over from the literal to the spiritual. Not unlike the crossing of a river, we are going to cross the river of Gurbani Gyan, the river of Gurbani messages, the river of Gurbani enlightenment, the river of spirituality from the banks of the literal to the banks of the spiritual. There are many ways to cross over. This is how most people cross over. I suppose follow someone else, the Granthi, the Kathavajak, the Parcharak, the Ragi, the Baba, etc. Pick up a tika and follow the tika. Follow the translations, follow the internet provided meanings. Follow some app on your device. Not much of a methodology is required here. Just hold tight and go wherever the guy in front takes you. In Punjabi is titled Pooch Fadke Par Langana, crossing over by holding on to the tail. God have mercy on you if the guy in front does not know how to swim, has no idea where he is going, or has no real pooch for you to hold on to, meaning he or she has no real substance to which you can hang on. This is one way of crossing over on your own. The rope represents the method. The rope represents the instrument. The rope represents the means of crossing. And this is what this series of videos are about. Giving you the method, the instrument, the means to cross over from the temporal to the spiritual. You will agree with me that this method shown in the picture is not the best one. So there are good methods and there are not so good methods. This is the method you want. This is the method this series of videos will aim and aspire to give you. Of course, you will have to walk across yourself, for yourself, by yourself. Some effort is called for. Let's begin by looking at this couplet of Farid to illustrate our first principle. It's on page 1382 of the Sri Guru Granth Sahib Ji. Farida मैं जानिया दुख मुझको दुख सबाया जग. The translation that is available is Farid, I know pain was inflicted on me. The whole world is in pain. The next verse is ऊंचे चढ़ के देखिया ता घर घर एहा अग. Again, the translation that is available is I climbed the hill and saw that every house was on fire. Now, if we put the two verses of the couplet together, it will read Farida मैं जानिया दुख मुझको दुख सबाया जग ऊंचे चढ़ के देखिया ता घर घर एहा अग. The translation would be Farid, I know pain was inflicted on me. The world is in pain. I climbed the hill and saw that every house was on such fire. So you see, what happens in a literal translation are the following three things. One, a literal translation merely changes the language of the presentation from the original to English. Two, both verses appear disjointed. Ask yourself, what is the connection between Farid saying, pain is inflicted on me, and him climbing a hill, or the fire that burns in every house? 3. Such a translation does not create any real understanding of the messages. The net result is that the spiritual messages of the couplet remain hidden. So we have to make this leap from the literal to the spiritual. But how? Well, we make that leap by doing the following four things. One, we attempt to find the spiritual meanings of the individual words that are used in the verse. Two, we identify where metaphors are being used. Three, we identify where idioms are being used. And four, we use context. We will talk about context in detail in video 3, but for now, we need to know that context can come from a number of sources, and one source is the verse before or the verse after. For this couplet of Farid, we will use the verses that follow this couplet. I will show them to you later in this video. So let's take the first verse again. Farida मैं जानिया दुख मुझको दुख सबाया जग. The meanings of the individual words now will be as follows. मैं refers to I or me. Janya in the literal sense means to know or to understand. The spiritual meaning of Janya within Gurbani is realized. Dukha means pain or sorrow. Mujhko means inflicted on me. Sabaya means entire. Jag means the world. Sabaya Jag is an idiom that refers to mankind. The translation of the verse would thus be, Farid, I realized that the sorrow that inflicted me was the sorrow that inflicted mankind. We do the same for the next verse. Uchche chad ke dekhiya ta kar kar eha ag. The meanings of the individual words now would be, Uchche literally means high or a hill. Chadke literally means to climb. Uchche chadke is an idiom that means the elevated state of the mind. Dekhya literally see, but the spiritual meaning of dekhya is realized. Jap Bani has this verse, Et raha pat pavdiya chadiya hoye ekis. Becoming one through the elevation of one's mind, through the elevation of the thought processes, through the elevation of a thinking way. That's the spiritual meaning of Uchche Chadke. The next word, Ta, means then. Karkar literally means every home. The metaphoric meaning of Karkar is every human being. Eha Aga literally means this same fire. The spiritual meaning of Aga is temporal desires. This is coming from the context, which is coming from the next verse. The translation of the verse would thus be, the elevated state of spirituality is the realization that every human being is inflicted with the same temporal desires. Now, let's put the couplet of Farid together. Farida मैं जानिया दुख मुझको दुख सबाया जग उच्चे चढ़ के देखिया ता कर कर एहा अग. The meaning would be, Farid, I realized that the sorrow that inflicted me was the sorrow that inflicted mankind. The elevated state of spirituality is the realization that every human being is inflicted with similar temporal desires. Now, you may want to ask, what are the spiritual messages within this couplet? We can think of three. One, my pain and sorrow is not uniquely mine. It's part and parcel of life and living. It's what makes us human beings within mankind. Two, I need to come to such a realization. Three, an elevated state of spirituality is required to know the source, the origins, and the roots of this sorrow, which is temporal desires. Why are the above three messages necessary in life? Again, we can think of three reasons. One, once we realize that pain and sorrow are part and parcel of life, we will stop asking, why me? Each time a disease, a setback, or a problem arises, we ask, why must I have that disease? We run to the Gurdwara and we ask the Guru, Guru, there are 9 billion people. Why did you choose me to have a heart attack? Why select me to have an accident? And so on. 2. Such a realization is necessary to live in contentment, to live in Sahaj. This realization is necessary to stop the unnecessary and repeated prayers of wanting the sorrow to go away. The realization is necessary to be able to empathize and sympathize with humanity. And 3, the realization of the source, the root, or the origins of our problems is necessary so that we can do something about it. These are the messages that are embedded within the couplet of Farid. We needed to get from the literal to the spiritual to get to these messages. Let's look at the next verse. Mahalla Panjama, Farida Pumarangavali, Manja Visula Bag. You may ask, why Mahalla Panjama in the middle of an ongoing slok of Farid? Because Farid said that pain and sorrow was caused by temporal desires. Guru Arjan Ji wants to put that into context, hence this couplet. These are the meanings of the individual words. Pum literally means the earth or the world. The metaphoric meaning of Pum would be the temporal world. Rangavali literally means colorful. The metaphoric meaning is mesmerizing, enthralling. Manj literally upon, spiritually means within. Vesula, literal meaning of which is thorns. The metaphoric meaning of Vasula is pain and sorrow. The spiritual meaning of that would be temporal desires. Bagh means a flourishing orchard, plot, a garden. And the metaphoric meaning of Bagh is life itself. The literal meaning is thus, Mahalla Panjama, Farid, upon this colorful earth flourishes an orchard of thorns. If you look at the literal meaning, you will get nothing. The spiritual message, however, is Mahalla Panjama, Farid, the temporal world is enthralling, within which are lived lives of desire. If you make the spiritual leap, you will see the connection to the whole bigger picture of temporal desires. This is the next verse. Jojan Pir ne Vajaya Tinna Anchana Lag. Meaning of individual words are as follows. Jo, who, those. Jan literally means a devotee, a seeker of realization, seeker of enlightenment. Pir is the Guru. Ne Vajaya means blessed. Tinna means those. Anch literally means heat, the spiritual meaning of which is temporal desires. Na, negative. Lag means inflicted. So the meaning of the verse therefore is Guru blessed seekers of enlightenment escape the infliction of temporal desires. Now, Pyareo, because Guru Arjan Ji is replying to Farid and because Guru Arjan is talking about temporal desires, we now know that Farid is also talking about temporal desires. So the phrase in Farid's couplet, Karkar Eha Agar, literally means every house is on fire, but the spiritual message is everyone is inflicted with temporal desires. This then is the beauty of context. we derived the meaning of Farid's Kar Kar Eha Ag from the verses of Guru Arjan Ji that come after Farid's. Here is one more example. Asa Mahalla Pehla, Akhan Jeevan Visray Mar Jaun, Akhan Aukha Sacha Now. The translation that is available everywhere is, chanting it, I live. Forgetting it, I die. It is so difficult to chant the true name. We can see clearly that firstly, such a literal translation merely changes the language of presentation from original to English. Secondly, it does not create any real understanding of the messages. Thirdly, it is factually unrealistic. And finally, its spiritual messages remain hidden. Let's look at some of the factually incorrect assertions within such a translation. Akha Jeeva Visray Mar Jao, translation, I live when I chant and die when I forget. 1.3 billion people in China, 145 million people in communist Russia, and millions elsewhere do not chant his name, but they are all alive. My own story is that I forget, I visray all the time, but I am still alive. Then the translation of Akhan Aukha Sacha Now is, it's difficult to chant your true name. Really? What is so difficult about chanting? Bani says, Ram Ram Karta Sab Jag Fire. The whole world goes about saying or chanting his name. So it makes no sense. Remember, what does not make sense is the translation. And that is because it is a literal translation. Now, let me summarize the first principle of our methodology. The message is spiritual. The language is temporal. The message is divine. The terminology is worldly. The message is spiritual. The vocabulary is literal. A crossing over is needed from the literal to the spiritual. A leap is needed. Both remain undone if we just take literal translations and leave it at that. This then is the challenge in understanding Gurbani. The writers of Gurbani have had no choice but to use the language of the temporal world to get their spiritual messages across. And we too have no choice but to understand, interpret, and explain the spirituality of Gurbani in the same defective, spiritually that is, temporal language. In our everyday language then, the default mode for interpreting the messages of Gurbani is literal. But we need to cross over to the spiritual message. That is our journey. It is a journey of intellectual crossing. It is a journey of intellectual discovery. It is a journey that involves a leap, an intellectual one, from the banks of the literal to the other side where the deeply rich and intended spiritual messages lie. Few of us cross over. Most of us are stranded on this side, on the banks of the literal. Some spend their entire life walking up and down the banks of this side, the banks of the literal, and they never cross over. You go to the Gurdwara, and the Granthi, the Kathakar, the Ragi, the Parcharak, all give us literal meanings. You look up at the screen in the Gurdwara and you read the literal meanings. You check your apps on your phone or your device, they are full with literal meanings. You look up the internet, do Google searches, you get literal meanings. Baudh Janam, for example. This is what I mean when I say our entire life is spent walking up and down the banks of this side, the banks of the literal, and we never cross over. The crossing over to the spiritual messages is difficult, challenging, and demanding. But it is deeply fulfilling. It is inherently satisfying and intensely rewarding because the joy of knowing the intended messages is immense and beyond comparison for the Gurbani believing Sikh. I am hoping that when you got to know the spiritual messages of the couplet of Farid we discussed above, you found the understanding to be satisfying and rewarding, that the spiritual messages were meaningful. You see, Pyareo, living life and dealing with the challenges of life is not about asking why me. Living life and dealing with the challenges of life is not about praying for the challenges to go away or to be put away. It's about the need to live in contentment, in Sahaj. It's about being content with my joys and realizing that sorrows are part and parcel of life and living. I need to elevate my mental framework, elevate my mindset to get to this realization. We saw earlier that all of these messages came out from the couplet of Farid when we made the leap from the literal to the spiritual. So yes, Pyareo, the task is challenging, but it is deeply fulfilling, satisfying, and rewarding because it brings the joy of knowing the intended messages. This challenge then is our Simran, is our Japa, our Tapa. This is our meditation, our sadhana, our contemplation. This is our Nitnem. Overcoming this challenge is our Aradhana, our prayer. This is our Patha, this is our Puja, worship of the Shabad. And these concepts that I mentioned, Simrana, Japa, Tapa, meditation, sadhana, contemplation, Nitnem, Aradhana, prayer, Path Puja, all of these have to be spiritually defined and not literally interpreted, of course. The writers of Gurbani were aware of the nature of this task pertaining to understanding the spiritual messages. They have provided adequate milestones and signboards within the Sri Guru Granth Sahib Ji along our spiritual journey to make sure we get to the intended destination of the envisioned messages. Our task is to find those signboards and to follow them. Pick up any English translation of Gurbani, and this is how these words are translated. They are translated as chanting of one word, a mantra, or a shabad over long hours while sitting or standing in a fixed positions. The ultimate aim is to simply perform the ritual. These are all literal meanings. These are the spiritual meanings of the same words: internalization, realization, inculcation of divine virtues, Nam, within our conscience. The ultimate aim here is of becoming the messages and becoming the virtues. So, what is the meaning of the verse Akha Jiva Visray Mar Jaun, Akhan Okha Sacha Now? Once we make the leap from the literal to the spiritual, then the individual meanings of the words are Akha, coming from the word Akharno, Kahno. It is said, claimed. Jiva means alive. Visra literally means forget or neglect. Its spiritual meaning is an unrealized state of the Creator within. Marjao literally means a state of death. The spiritual meaning of Marjao is undergoing spiritual death. Akhan, it is said, claimed. Okha, literally difficult, arduous. Sacha of the Creator pertaining to the Creator, divine, because the word Sacha comes from the word Sacha, which means the Creator or the divine. Now refers to divine virtues. The meaning of the verse is thus, Akha jiva visray mar jaun, I am said to be alive, yet in non-realization of my Creator within, I am in a state of spiritual death. Akhan Okha Sacha now, the realization of divine virtues is said to be arduous. Thank you for joining me in this journey towards understanding Gurbani yourself for yourself. The next video will look at the second principle, namely the Rahao principle.